Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, ATL TUG leadership team. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Thumbs up, just saying you can see my screen. Cool.
Yes.
All right, so as mentioned, this is a presentation focused on a collaborative Tableau dashboard between myself and Anna Foard, and it was in regards to visualizing what a COVID-19 reopening would look like. So we're here to walk you through the process, show you sort of an inside peek at how this came to be. Before we dive into that, I think it's helpful to have a little context as to who you're listening to. So my name is Christian Felix. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. I'm a graduate of the University of Arizona. My background is actually finance. I have a bachelor's and master's in finance. Started working at a company called Raytheon in finance after graduation, and then moved on to IT. And from there, I decided I wanted to get into the analytics space. So started doing a distance master's degree in analytics at Texas A&M. Got exposed to some of the SaaS products. But as I was doing that, as a student, you get a free year's license to Tableau. So I started playing around in Tableau and discovered that the productivity and efficiency surrounding the data exploration process was just so much more efficient. Fell in love with the tool. I've been using it ever since. That was back in 2013. Came back and helped introduce it at Raytheon. And for about the last 5 years, I've been working in self-service business intelligence at Roche here in Tucson. I get to work with Tableau every day. Also work with Alteryx, SQL, and not so much Excel anymore. But yeah, love my job, love what I do. Yeah, so that's me.
I'm Anna, and I've met a lot of you before, presenting because I'm from Atlanta. Wow, my background is pretty diverse. My background comes from a business degree from UGA. I started in marketing and very quickly switched to analytics when I worked in DC and worked for the corporate executive board, which is now part of Gartner. But at the time, analytics in the early 2000s was kind of under the radar. And I did ultimately decide to go back to school to be a math teacher. I taught math and statistics for 14 years here in the Atlanta area. And I also worked with people, specifically other teachers working on their dissertations with the numbers and crunching the statistics and also trying to explain the statistics. So while I was teaching AP statistics, I kept telling my students, you're not going to walk into a classroom with a graphing TI-84 calculator and expect people to take, I'm sorry, I said classroom, but I mean a boardroom, and people to take you seriously. Hey, check out my graph. So I started teaching them how to work with Excel, and then I fell into Tableau. I found Tableau, and as Christian mentioned, you can also get a free 1-year license if you're an educator. So I had my free Tableau license as an educator, and also the students could get their own and had them working with it. I gave them options to work with Excel and or Tableau, and found that it was just useful and helpful and very intuitive. Fast forward to now, I now teach people on the corporate side how to work with Tableau, specifically how to work with data, ask and answer business questions using Tableau. So in a nutshell, that's me. And I would say that our conversation started, and I'm going to let Christian pick up from here, but our conversation started because I think, Christian, we are on the same Zoom call with Steve Wexler, and we just happen to be talking about statistics and math, and that's more my forte. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah. So this is kind of like a cooking show. We get to the end result fairly quick here, but we'll dive into how we got there as we go. But this is what the end visual looks like. It's called Let's Keep Things Flat. It's really trying to give a visual understanding of, are we flattening the curve or not? That's really the big question that I think a lot of us globally, we're trying to understand and answer over the last couple months. So this is just specific to the US, but what it does is it gives you a multi-dimensional view, right? So you get a view over time. So these 4 columns are a user-defined interval, starting with the most recent date. You could look at it every 10 days and see how the map is changing. And so you get a national view, but you also get a detailed view at the county level. And these charts, we'll get into them as we go along, the strip plots and the sparklines, what they mean, but they give you, all of it combined really gives you tremendous insight into the recovery, the reopening process. Aside from the desktop view, we also have a mobile view, which I thought turned out excellent. I don't get to develop in mobile very often, so when I do public work, I try to do that. So let me just give you a glimpse of that if I can. So it allows a user to either look at the entire US or to look at a single state. Dashboard updates for their state, and you get a view of the counties and whether or not the counties are increasing at a decreasing rate or increasing at an increasing rate. And one of the really cool things about this visual is the way that I use the show hide container feature. So you're able to bring up some of the helpful hints and the instructions in the dashboard with these little cards very easily just by clicking on a button, just to help the user understand what it is they're looking at. So Anna mentioned how this came to be. Yes, it did start when we were on a Zoom call with Steve Wexler. I noticed her Twitter handle was the Stats Ninja, so she must be an expert at stats. And so here I am. I'll get to the right side of this, the map, in a little bit, but here I am trying to understand this term. What does it mean really mathematically, increasing at a decreasing rate? It seems to be almost oxymoronical, hard to understand. How should it be calculated? The simplest way so it could be easily understood and explained. So that's really the question I threw her way. What this was the very first iteration of the dashboard. This is using some native functionality within Alteryx that a guy named Ned Harding blogged about. It really allows you to randomize points within a spatial perimeter. So I had the county coordinates, and what it does is based off of the case count in a certain county, it can randomize spatial points within that perimeter. I went away from this for a couple reasons. One, it gave the illusion of more geographic specificity than actually existed within the data. And 2, the data just got to be so enormous. So what was happening is the data was being densified to the point where a single record was being created for each case, each day. And so very quickly you go into millions and millions of records, and performance just became an issue. So that's a little bit of context. The conversation continued. Anna, do you want to talk to this, or?
Yeah, I had to put on my math hat and try to explain as simply as I could over a chat. Kind of, we're looking at, for all purposes, slopes, derivatives, and derivatives of derivatives. So what we're trying to do when we're looking at increasing at a decreasing rate, and I'll talk about this more later, but we're just really trying to see, okay, what's the steepness of this graph and when is it going to start flattening out? And so, which is of course what we kind of keep hearing about, keeping things flat. So I'm trying to explain this over message, and then the last view that he showed was he was highlighting Cherokee County, because I was saying, well, here's what's happening in Cherokee County because that's where I live. So Christian tried to do a really good job of putting it in my context too. I'm gonna give it back to you, Christian.
Yeah, so these are just some numbers as of yesterday, just doing a quick Google search on COVID status. So 8.06 million confirmed cases globally, 2.2 million in the US. And if you go to Tableau Public and do a search on COVID, you'll get about 21,800 data visualizations published to Tableau Public. So all of that really left me, and I think a lot of people, in this information overload feeling. Makes you,
and sorry,
yeah.
I mean, and should we add, we all kind of felt a little hopeless.
Yeah. Yeah, so hopelessness, wanting to know when this is going to end, wanting to know what the path forward is like. And I, I think a good analogy, maybe you're going on a road trip, you have your kids in the back of the car, they're asking, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And they don't have any context. Um, you tell them soon, but they don't really have any context. There's not a firm answer. And so what we wanted to do was see if we could find a data-driven approach that would let us, being curious data analysts that we were, understand it better, and also let other people do the same. Um, so the last slide, you have information overload, you have sort of a foreboding sense of hopelessness, but at the same time, there's these people that are on the front lines, people working at the grocery stores, first responders, they're out there risking their health. And so I get the sense that, okay, I just create charts, I'm not essential, how can I give back? And so ultimately I wanted to do something, especially if I felt like it could help other people understand what was going on. Anna?
Yeah, and I was in the same boat. I had written an article previously that was talking about, and this goes along with what some people have just said in the chat. It was talking about how do we know which data we can rely on, which questions you should be asking when you look at the data, and one really big thing is what do we know that we don't know, and what don't we know? It was a moment of confusion, and actually I think we're still in a bit of the confusion part for our entire world. And confusion is a hard place to be. It's easier, well, obviously it's a hard place to be, but it's a hard place to be from a standpoint when you work with data, because we really don't know where it's going and what to look for if we don't even know the data's right. So we had to kind of step back and look at, okay, what can we look at objectively given what we have? We've all seen these curves of what's flattening the curve. Let's flatten it. And one thing I tried to do to kind of help myself through the confusion is try to say, well, okay, I know from teaching statistics that a density curve represents 100% of something. So if in this case, it's 100% of all the people who are going to catch this. We don't know what that number is, but the idea of flattening the curve doesn't mean we're going to stop it. It means that we are going to, over time, reduce the number of cases at one time. So that right there is what we were trying to look at, is how can we know that we're starting to decrease that, the slope really, which we'll talk about in a second, but how do we know that we're starting to now increase at a decreasing rate? And this is a picture, Nelson had some information about this, I believe 2 months ago. We were looking at, or maybe it was last month, the time's kind of all confusing me right now, but we were looking at the 1918 pandemic and what the curves looked like. So what to expect. Now, this wasn't number of cases. Again, in the last slide, we were looking at number of cases. This is actually number of deaths per 100,000. So that is different. However, the curves speak to the same idea that we're, and at the same time they were, trying to minimize that spike and bring that number of cases, stretch it out over time, rather all at one place. So when Christian came to me and asked me that question, I was like, funny you asked, because I just had this conversation with someone the other day. And I said, I'd really like to explain to someone the difference between looking at the numbers, and we're all still looking at it, by the way. How many do we have today? Just pure numbers versus growth rates. So I gave this example. Now, bear in mind, I understand that there's a lot of variation involved, and we'll talk to that in a minute. So this example is not saying that in 5 days we know a growth rate is going up or down. That's not, this is just an example of the math. But let's just say 3 days ago, the total number of cases were just 10, because we were starting it kind of early when Christian and I were looking at this. So I was trying to start at a very beginning number. And then the next day we're at 30, and then we're at 90, and then we're at 180, and then tomorrow we're at 270. So that doesn't look like there's much hope, right? So I said, well, what if we look at it differently? Because instead of total numbers, what if we looked at it as growth? So look in the second column. What I did with that is I said, and this is how in mathematics, you can figure out what your growth factor is. It's basically, what did you have to multiply by to get to the next number? So I use these simple numbers so you can understand where this is. I'm not questioning anyone's intelligence. This just makes it easier to digest. So from the 3 days ago to 2 days ago, we multiplied by 3. And then the next time by 3 again. But then look, that growth factor going from yesterday to today is 2. That means instead of tripling, hey, guess what? We're now doubling. That's not a bad thing if we're looking at the growth factor instead of just raw numbers. And then of course I look to see, well, then if tomorrow we're at 270, that's actually a growth factor of 1.5, meaning we multiplied 180 by 1.5 instead of tripling. We can also look at growth rates, which you guys are probably more aware of and more comfortable with. And a growth rate is also going to just tell us the percent change from one day to the next. So we're growing by 200%, down to 100%, down to 50%. And to me, that tells and paints a more promising, hopeful story for someone who's just looking at the raw numbers. So somebody can really digest what's going on. And then finally, as we were talking about increasing at a decreasing rate, for those of you who are really into the calculus and the numbers, that's honestly the slope of the tangent line to the curve. We want to look for what's called inflection points to know when we are changing course. So when we're increasing at an increasing rate, obviously we're traveling up. If we read graphs left to right, so going left to right, we're starting to travel up pretty fast. But as we get to that quadrant that's named B, we can start to see that the tangent line is to that curve at the top there is going to be a lot less steep. So meaning the slope of that line is less steep. That's called a derivative. So for those of you, bringing back the calculus there. And then at the very top of that, where it plateaus at the top, if we were to draw a line at the top, it's horizontal. The slope of a horizontal line is 0, meaning there's 0 change. And then as we go into quadrant C, you can see that we're decreasing. We're speeding up as we're going down. And then at the bottom, it's going to start leveling out again. So that's what those words mean. But we realized as we were talking, Christian and I, especially because we bounced this off of another friend, I asked Ben Jones, like, hey, what do you think? He's like, I don't know if people can digest increasing at an increasing rate versus increasing a decreasing rate. I'm like, you're right. Because here I've been stuck in math land thinking, oh, everyone knows what this means, but that's not true. So what we realized in talking to each other is we kind of had an idea of what we wanted to show, but we realized that it's really hard to digest and hard to explain. Yes, I live in math land, Josh. I do.
Yeah, so this is a sample of the visualization landscape at the time we were producing this viz. This is from the New York Times, but it's a variation on a theme. Other publications had similar visualizations out there. And it's, as Anna was saying, it's in counts, right? So it's only useful to a certain extent, particularly when the focus needs to be on change. The other issue with this that I would perhaps take exception to is the fact that the morbidity rate associated with COVID is actually quite low. And so you're using a red that typically in the visualization space represents something very serious and death and things like that. And so there's a potential issue there as well. But so all in all, we wanted to produce something that more specifically answers the question that I thought many people wanted to understand. And this is perhaps a little bit better. It gives you a visual more easily of whether or not the curve is flattening, decreasing, but still it's quite busy and it's at the country level as well. We wanted to get more localized than that. I came across this back in late March. This is through the American Enterprise Institute, put out by Dr. Scott Gottlieb and a team. And for me, in that moment, it was one of the first really tangible things I could put my hands on that says, yes, this is a data-driven framework that I could say, I could look at the data and answer the question, at least roughly, now is when we should start to look at reopening, because data says that we've reached so-and-so point. So within this, he gives several phases. Phase one, slow the spread. And there's data-driven thresholds for each of when we should move on to the next phase. And this one that I've highlighted says the trigger for a move to phase two should be when a state reports a sustained reduction in cases for at least 14 days. Similar language ultimately ended up in the guidance released by the White House in April. And so those two things combined says, okay, this is what we need to be visualizing. We need to move away at this point from all of the raw case counts and put together something that visualizes, that answers very easily, are we or are we not meeting this 14-day sustained decrease threshold? This is just something that really drives all of the work that I do and all of the work that the team does at Roche, who I work with, really trying to answer, provide an answer to the question within 10 seconds of a consumer getting to your dashboard. So is high-level situational awareness easily attained when somebody comes to your dashboard, or do they have to start digging around? And so that was the objective with this as well. This was a quote that I thought was pertinent that I stole from an Edward Tufte book. Everyone spoke of information overload, but what there was, in fact, was a non-information overload. So we have all these charts, all these graphs, but very few, if any, at least at the point where Anna and I were working on this, really answered that big question, which is what locations, what counties in the US are experiencing a downward trajectory of confirmed cases within a 14-day period. Now, since this time, there have been others that have been produced, published by various parties that do a great job of answering that. But at the time, there simply wasn't many. So this is an example of what we did. Anna, do you want to talk to this in terms of the seasonality, smoothing, and some of the things that we ultimately ended up doing?
Yeah, so part of the problems with looking at just pure numbers and also growth rates and anything like that is if we go day to day, we can have just natural variation. For example, just by chance, just more people could be tested on one day versus another. I mean, that leaves another problem where we can have a spike one day versus the next just by chance. We saw, and if you guys were watching the data, you would see that Sundays, the numbers would go down, and that doesn't mean there was less cases on Sunday. It's just less testing because it's Sunday. So we have to take into account natural variation and that variability in the data, which is why Christian decided to go with a rolling average. And I believe you were comparing a 14-day rolling average. Did you start with a 2-day and then go to a 3-day, or how did you do that?
Yeah, I did, because I think you alluded to it either on the call or before. All the days sort of seemed to run together and be a blur in this social distancing, stay-at-home phase of life, but really there was seasonality, and there is seasonality in the data. So if you look at the weekends, for example, and maybe even a Friday, there's just not as many people going to get tested and not as many confirmed cases. So we wanted to smooth that as much as possible. And so we compared the 3-day moving average to that 14-day sort of one incubation, one quarantine period to do the comparison. And what we're looking at here is Orleans County, Louisiana, where it was one of the very early hotspots. And so you see this rapid increase in case counts, but coming down the curve and ultimately dropping below the 14-day moving average line in mid-April. And so the implementation of this, it would have been possible within Tableau, table calcs, other ways, but I wanted to maximize performance as much as possible. So I did a lot of the prep work in Alteryx. And so what we're looking at here, I'll try and walk you through this sheet. You have the 3-day moving average increase, the 14-day moving average increase, And what I'm doing is just assigning, comparing these two, is there an increase or is there a decrease? And then all I'm doing is counting the consecutive, the consecutive responses in a row. And so where there's increases after increase, it continues to count sequentially. Where it changes, it starts over again. And so we have this color coding that gets darker and darker the more days consecutively you run into. And so looking at the graph again, it helps you understand how the color coding really plays in to the data. And then you look at the map, and this is when I think, at least me, maybe Anna as well, really started to get encouraged by looking at the data, because you start getting into late April and the map becomes very blue, much bluer. And so you have a lot of orange as you get into late March, early April. But then sometime around the mid-April, you see a lot of these counties really turning the corner. And instead of going from consecutive days increasing, you have consecutive days decreasing.
And I just want to add, there's probably, we could get a screenshot of our messages, because I remember messaging and being like, I suddenly feel like there's some hope after looking at what you had created, watching that change. And something that I've heard a lot of talk recently, like in the last 2 weeks, when I can hear people talking about the data, and they've been saying, okay, at the macro level, it looks like this, but on a micro level, it looks like this. But I never heard that until, in fact, when I started looking at yours, I said, well, looking at the county level versus the country level, which is kind of what one of the other big differences with this visualization is, it's suddenly what you were able to draw out pieces of, like I said, hope and just like, okay, we're not going to be stuck here forever feeling. I'll let you go on.
I think Christian might have got frozen.
The stuck here forever feeling. Right there. It's perfect. It might have been frozen. But I'll just add to that I have recently, as we're seeing the number of cases increase, again, we've seen a lot more talk of people saying, but if you go down to the state, even county level, we are seeing some differences. There's still some hope in there. It's not all doom and gloom. I could probably share my screen, but I probably need, I think he dropped off, but I can share my screen. I have it just to keep it rolling here. I don't have the cool animations, I don't think. Let's see. I'll share mine if that works. Can I do that?
Go for it.
Sure. Okay. And then if he gets back on, we can switch, because he, as in Christian, is the mastermind. Okay, you're probably seeing the wrong screen. Oh no, that's what I get. Are you seeing which screen are you seeing?
It says fold by geography.
Okay, so it's not the presenter screen. Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, apparently I wasn't really prepped to switch off like this. So, all right. So he's showing the Johns Hopkins University data. And again, when he jumps back on, I'll let him take it away. But this is where he was going to talk about the end product and just those details. So he will also probably have to come back and talk about his shapes. So
I'm back. Can you all hear me?
You're back? Oh, good. Okay, I'll drive and you can talk.
I apologize for that. I think the issue with this map is your focus automatically goes to Southern California and Arizona, because it's the biggest space on the map that's red, because it's the largest size of the counties at that point, where really a lot of the cases were in New York, New Jersey, and that's where your focus should be. So this really demonstrated the need to visualize the data in multiple ways. And so if you can go to the next slide, Anna, just a bit of technical details before I go into visualizing in multiple ways. I use a tool called Map Shaper. One of the things that I do not like, and I think this may be an improvement in future releases, but you visualize the US and you need to include Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. But the map is skewed because of the size of Alaska. So you got to use some tool, whether it's QGIS or Map Shaper or some other geographical tool to resize Alaska and replace it to the south of the contiguous US. So that's what I did. And go ahead to the next slide. So yeah, we wanted to visualize it in multiple ways. So we have the map, we have the county-based choropleth, but also the strip plots. So the strip plots show 30-day segments by county. You're able to see within that 30-day time period whether or not the county is increasing or decreasing. And the black bar chart shows the peak case count for each county. So you're very quickly able to see within that 30-day time period, has the peak case count been recent or has it been further in the past? Go ahead, Anna. Additionally, there's Sparklines. And on the right, you see sort of the instructions on how to read it that I included in the visual as well. But what the Sparklines do is show the doubling time. So we wanted to show the increasing and decreasing sequential days, but also visualize it another way, showing the doubling time. So really that's the amount of days that it takes for the case count to double. And so the larger the number, the better. And so the red dots within the Sparklines show the minimum doubling time within that date range. And then again, you have the 30-day time period that's represented by the black line in the Sparklines as well. All right, and so the results. So this ended up being featured by Tableau, and it gives a quick demo to the usability, the filtering, and it was quite the surprise. It ended up also being a viz of the day. If you go to the next slide, I think. Yeah, a viz of the day, and it also ended up being, the article was a Data Viz Society featured write-up. So a lot of things came out of this. It was a cool collaboration, and Anna, I'll turn it back over to you to talk to some of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that I was included in this conversation because honestly, it was Christian's visualization, but he brought me into the discussion. We talked about things. He bounced things off of my math brain, and I was able to learn so much. He would give me the workbook, and I would work backwards and learn so much in Tableau that I didn't know. So in a way, I feel like this was a way for me to learn as I'm just talking to him about these ideas and these concepts with working with data. The best part about this is I got a good friend out of this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And so I'll just add that second quote because I think it's wisdom. And regardless of how big your contributions are perceived to be, there's sort of unknown benefits that as a team member are just brought to the table, whether it's a prompting question or just an accountability saying, hey, where are you at with this? Anna mentioned getting feedback from different members of the community. Some of that feedback was good, some of that was negative. And so for every Tableau public viz that I have out in my profile, there's probably one that never quite made it over the line. And so this was very much in the realm of possibility that this would be there also. And so just having somebody to ask questions, to get some real good answers and some engagement with was incredibly helpful. So it was a great team effort. It was fun, and I feel like it was well worth the time. So that's it.
And one more thing, when I would say that when there was negative feedback, you could have very easily said, well, that was a good idea. But instead, you pushed through, you fixed things, you changed things, you altered your course and created this spectacular visualization.